We say things like, maybe later, perhaps another time, or I'll see you tomorrow. But for some of us, there won't be a tomorrow. Listen as your worst nightmares come to life. These nightmares have become someone's reality. My name is Justin Crowley, and this is The Murder Project. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 33 of The Murder Project. In this episode, it is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be more of a information episode, as I will not have Mike with me, and he will not be able to join me for the debrief this week because something came up, and I will allow him to explain that whenever he comes back next week if he so chooses. So I wanted to take this time to talk about a case that has kind of been brought back up in national news, and this is the case of Julius Jones and the murder of Paul Howell, and the fact that Julius Jones was convicted of Paul Howell's murder and sentenced to be executed, and with 4 hours to the execution, literally 4 hours before Julius Jones was supposed to be executed, the governor stepped in, commuted his death sentence, and he was given life without parole. So it's a kind of crazy deal, but I want to tell that story this week because it's national news. A lot of people are talking about it. So I want to give you my 2 cents. Should be a good episode, so strap in, ladies and gentlemen. Episode 33 starts right now. As I mentioned, this episode will be more of an informative episode. I wanted to really break this one down because when I heard about it last week, everything that I read in the articles stated that Julius Jones, a man that was possibly innocent of the crime that he was convicted for, was about to be sentenced to death. And what I read was that the Oklahoma Pardons and Parole Board had already approved 3-1 his stay of execution, and also a recommendation for his execution to be commuted. And I know that Julius Jones's attorneys and family and members of the Innocence Projects and things like that were wanting his sentence to be commuted to time served, which means that after all of this has gone on, over 20 years in prison, he would be able to be released. That is not what happened. His death sentence was commuted, but it was turned to life without the possibility of parole. Now, as far as his appeals go and the processes involved with that, we're going to have to wait to see if he is able to try to get a new trial or try to have his previous case thrown out due to several reasons, all of which I will talk about in this episode. I feel like there's been a lot of cases that have kind of popped up like this recently, and so with this one being as fresh as it is, I wanted to go ahead and talk about it, especially because I had learned about this case, and then I was watching a couple of days ago, I believe on Friday, and I was waiting to see if Julius was going to be executed or if his sentence was going to be commuted, because there was a lot of things that are involved in this case that have me asking a lot of questions and also make me question a lot of things that are being said. So I really wanted to go through and talk about a lot of these things, especially because I feel like we've got the time to do it right now. So unless Mike is able to join us, there probably won't be a debrief on this one. So I'm really going to dive into a lot of the details, and I'm really going to speak. I'm going to tell you guys the full story about everything and how I feel about the whole thing. Kind of change it up a little bit, but I wanted to at least give you guys an episode this week as we're coming into the holidays, and that way we can kind of pick back up after the holidays and keep cruising. So I think the best way to break this case down would be to tell you what Julius Jones was convicted of and the story that goes along with that. Then I'll give you Julius's story, and then we'll kind of fill the gaps in between and see if we can kind of move towards a better decision on if we can make heads or tails of this thing. Because you're going to have one side that is for Julius, and then you're going to have one side that's against Julius. So I think it's important for us to discuss both sides of those, and where we fall after that, is solely based off the information that we have at this point. And one of the things that I found about doing research on the internet is most of the articles that are on the internet are heavily in favor of Julius Jones. He also has a lot of backing from, like I said, the Innocence Project, and also a lot of celebrities have jumped on Julius's case and have tried to help him out and help get him off death row, which ultimately has been accomplished. And this is to the joy of some and the disbelief of others. So let's dive in and see where we're at. Now, this whole story takes place around Oklahoma City, and it's in the Oklahoma City, Edmond, and Normand areas, and these are all, within 10 to 20 minutes of each other, roughly, depending on where you are in the city. So I may be specific on what towns they're in, but for the most part, we're talking about Oklahoma City in general. On Wednesday, July 28th, the way that the story is told is that Julius Jones and his friend, and I use that term loosely because Julius says that he was kind of just not necessarily a friend, but an acquaintance. So his friend, Chris Jordan, and Julius were together on the night of Wednesday, July 28th, 1999. And from what the details of the case say, they were looking for someone to carjack. They wanted to steal someone's car, and so they were together looking for a mark, a person to carjack. Now, Paul Howell was a guy who was a resident of Edmond, Oklahoma, which is just north of Oklahoma City, about 8 miles or so. And he was shopping with his sister Megan and his 2 daughters, which I'll leave their names out, but at the time they were 9 and 7 years old. So they had just come from shopping together. I believe that if we were to speculate on this, there is probably reason to believe that they were seen driving around as they were leaving one of these shopping areas or something of that nature. Julius and Chris Jordan follow Paul, his sister, and his kids home. He was driving a black 1997 Suburban, so at the time a 2-year-old Suburban. They follow Hal back to his parents' house. When Hal pulls up in the driveway, Julius runs up to the car. He tries to carjack him. Something which is unknown goes wrong, and Paul Howell is shot and killed in front of his sister and in front of his 2 children. Now, after this, it is said that Julius Jones is able to get the Suburban, and he leaves, and he goes with Chris Jordan following him, and they are going now to try to see if they can unload the Suburban. Because what happens normally in situations like this is after you steal the vehicle, if you're going to try to get money off of it, or if it's not just a crime of opportunity or something like that, is you steal the vehicle, you get it to a middleman who can get it to a chop shop, or if you have direct access to a chop shop where they can disassemble the vehicle and sell it for parts, or if you have more of a sophisticated chop shop, they can try to change VIN numbers and do things like that so the vehicle can be resold and they can get more money for it. If you're not able to do that, the next best thing is you take it to a chop shop, they disassemble the whole thing, and they sell all the parts off for money. So if you're the person that's bringing a vehicle to a chop shop, they're basically going to pay you some sort of a finder's fee, where the more luxurious or rare or nice vehicle you can get, the more money you get. And typically they have sort of a list of vehicles that they want because they know that they can move the parts quicker. So you get better money for better vehicles. So what is said is that after the murder of Paul Howell, Chris and Julian go and they meet up with one of their friends. Their friend's name is Liddell King. And before all of this took place, King, Chris Jordan, and Julius Jones all knew each other. And that's kind of how they tied all this in. So they went to King to see if he could unload the vehicle for them. And King stated that he had watched Julius park the Suburban and then asked King if he knew anybody that wanted to buy the vehicle. And so King was known as a guy who dealt with stolen cars and parts and kind of was a middleman and got people together. And they basically had to leave the vehicle overnight to see if they can try to find somebody that would take the vehicle the next day. Now, as far as the process goes for a chop shop and stealing vehicles for a chop shop, you're not going to want that vehicle to be able to sit overnight. You're going to want to unload it as quickly as possible and get it off the streets so it's less likely that the vehicle's found, or it's less likely that you get arrested in the vehicle and charged with the theft of the vehicle. And in this case, there's a murder attached to it. What is said is that the vehicle was left nearby King's apartment, and the next day they were trying to find someone to buy it or to give it to. There was a man named Lottie, his name that he's referred to as Lottie, that usually purchased vehicles for them. And Lottie refused to get the vehicle because he stated that he heard that there was a body attached to it, which that means that this person who ran the chop shop already knew that someone had been killed over the carjacking, and they did not want this vehicle. It was going to be too hot. There's going to be too much police presence. That only means that the police, if they find it in his chop shop, all those people go down, their kind of criminal activities, their organized crime operation is then shut down. And so because the vehicle is so hot, he refuses to take the vehicle. After this, the vehicle is dumped in a grocery store parking lot, and a few days, a day or two goes by, and King decides that he is going to go to the police and tell them what he knows, because he's afraid that because he's now seen the vehicle, I believe he's been in the vehicle, that if the police find the vehicle and run it for prints or DNA or anything like that, somehow it's going to get tied to him, and he doesn't want to be involved with this murder. So he goes to the police and he tells them basically what happened, that all of these things took place, that Jordan and Jones, Chris Jordan and Julius Jones, had showed up and said that they had this vehicle, that Julius had told King that he was the one who shot Paul Howell, and they were trying to unload this vehicle. So after all of this takes place, the police decide that they're going to go and talk to Chris Jordan, because at this time, you have to remember that the police only have King's story. So King said that Julius told him he was the one that pulled the trigger, and that Chris Jones was basically the wheelman. He was in the getaway vehicle. He dropped Jones off at the house where Paul Howell pulled up to. Jones was the shooter, and Chris followed him with their vehicle back to where they were trying to offload it at. So when the police go and talk to Chris, he says that what King said was true. He said that they pulled up at the house and Julius got out. He shot Paul and then took the vehicle. So he basically fingers Julius as the murderer and then tells on himself basically for being the wheelman, and basically says that he can provide them with the murder weapon. And so when the police ask where the murder weapon is, he says it is at Julius's house. It is in a attic crawl space area, and it is wrapped in a red bandana, which is all pretty specific, very specific information about where all of this is at. So the police then get a warrant for Julius Jones's parents' house because he has an apartment over in Norman. At the time that all this is going on, he is a sophomore at OU, at Oklahoma University of Oklahoma. And so he has an apartment in Norman, but at the time he is staying at his parents' house. So they get a warrant for Julius's parents' house. They go and they search the house. When they go to the place that Chris stated the gun would be, they found the gun, and they found it in a red bandana. Now, it would later be said, which I didn't find a whole lot of information on this, but in one article I did read that Jones's DNA was found on this red bandana, and that is another way that they kind of linked this to him. And after this, Julius was found over at a friend's house. He was sleeping on the couch, something like that, and he was arrested. Now, when Julius is arrested and taken in for questioning, he denies that any of this took place. He says that he was not involved in any carjackings, that he had not shot anybody, and that Chris had shown up to his house to pick him up after this incident had happened and told him that he had got into it with some guys and he shot somebody. Julius says he didn't really ask a whole lot of questions about it because it's best if he didn't know a lot. And they kind of went on about their business. And he is charged with the murder of Paul Howell. And Chris Jordan is also charged with the murder of Paul Howell, being an accomplice. But at the time, King is not charged with anything. And so what starts to happen, what kind of starts developing is that King is going to cut a deal with the police in the DA's office. Chris Jones is also going to cut a deal with the DA's office. And for this, they are going to get either reduced or no sentences. For King, he was not even charged with anything in relation to this crime based off the testimony that he gave against Julius. And Chris Jordan was given 30 years for his involvement in the crime. And then once Julius went to trial, King and Chris Jordan testified against Julius. And one of the things that is sort of interesting about all this is that Julius's defense team did not really dispute anything that was being said about their client. They didn't call any witnesses on behalf. They did not let Julius testify. There was a lot of things that happened that I feel are a little strange for a capital murder case, what we in Texas would define as a capital murder case. Because not only did you have the offense of the murder, but it is in the commission of another felony, which aggravates the crime, which makes it eligible for the death penalty. And apparently in Oklahoma, it is the same because Julius was being threatened with the death penalty this whole time, saying that if he did not cooperate, he was going to get the death penalty. And it's even said in one article that the DA, when interviewed about this incident the night that it happened, said that the person who's found responsible for doing this is going to get the death penalty. And the DA is a little bit of a character himself, but we'll see if we got time for that later. So after the trial, Julius is convicted of the murder, and he is put on death row. Now, he spends a lot of time on death row, and he tries to go through appeals. He tries to get his name cleared. He's trying to get his information out, and basically what he's saying from the get-go is that he doesn't understand how he got framed for this murder when he had an alibi for the entire night. He was never able to testify. No one ever got to hear his side of the story, and so there was a lot of back and forth in the appeals process, and trying to get a spot with the Oklahoma Pardons and Parole Board to, plea his case and try to save his own life. And he had a lot of people that were helping him do this, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, he was given this opportunity. And when he goes in and talks to the parole board, he gives them his version of the events that happened that night. And I actually watched the video, and there are a lot of interesting things on there. So I'll give you now Julius's side. And what Julius said is that on the night of the murder, he was at his mother's house. He was there with his mother, his brother, and his sister. I'm not sure if his father was at the house at the time, but I have heard both that he was. And he said that after, on this specific day, one of his friends had showed up to his house and dropped him off a belated birthday gift. It was one of those custom cookie cakes, and that he had spent the day at the house. He had eaten some of the cookie cake. He had been playing video games with his brother. There was also talk about him playing Monopoly with his brother and his sister. Either way, it states that he had dinner that night with his parents, and before his mother was scheduled to take his brother to work. He worked down at a overnight gas station that stayed open all night. His shift began at 10 p.m. and he got off at 6 a.m. And Julius said that before his mother left to take his brother to work between 9:30 and 10 p.m., he had a conversation with his mother. He was telling her that he was upset about his brother and his sister eating the majority of his cookie cake, and that he was not happy about all of that. And he remembers that conversation specifically. He remembers playing the game. In one article it says Monopoly, in one article it says he was playing video games. Nonetheless, he says that he remembers all of that taking place. The dinner, they had spaghetti, they had the cookie cake. He was upset about it. His brother is there, his sister's there, his mom's there, his dad's there. And then his mom leaves, takes his brother to work, and all of this is going on at the time that this murder is supposed to be happening that Julius committed. After the crime was committed, Julius said that, unknown to him, Chris was already supposed to come pick him up because Julius needed to go to his apartment in Norman and pick up some extra clothes so that he can come back to his parents' house since he was staying there. And he said that Julius stated that Chris was supposed to pick him up earlier in the night, but he did not show up. So when he showed up around 11:30 p.m., Julius was very upset with Chris. Either way, he says that he gets in the car with Chris. Chris takes him to his apartment in Norman. Julius gets some clothes. Sometime in between him getting picked up and getting the clothes, Julius says that Chris told him that he had got into it with some guys, and he ended up having to shoot one of them. But he says that he doesn't really ask any questions about any of that because he feels like it's better for him. So after this, Julius states that they go to a friend's house and they are hanging out there. And either that early that morning or the next day, Chris asks him if he can help him move a vehicle, and he says that he will. And this is where King comes in yet again, and he says that when they get over to where King's apartment is, King asks him if he'll drive the Suburban for him. Julius says that because he has known King to kind of dabble in stolen vehicles and things like that, he assumes that the vehicle is probably stolen, so he says no. He said that King then got into the Suburban and drove it to a location, and then after that he drove it to a supermarket. He said when they got to the supermarket, King went inside the supermarket. Julian then states that he goes in to see what King is doing. King comes out of the supermarket. They get into King's car. They leave the Suburban at the grocery store, and then they leave. And it is after all of this happens that Julius is getting kind of this feeling, from what he says, that he might be involved in some sort of crime now. And after all of this happens, Julius meets back up with Chris Jordan, and they go over to his parents' house. While they're at his parents' house, Julian states that he is downstairs talking on the phone. Chris is upstairs in Julian's bedroom talking on the other phone. They leave. They go and do some other stuff. Basically what happens is that they end up back at Julian's parents' house, and they stay the night there. Now, when they stay the night at his house, Julian says that he allowed Chris to stay in his bedroom, which is upstairs, and that he slept on the sofa downstairs. And that at this time, that is when Julian believes that Chris takes the gun and plants it at his house. So, he says that he had no involvement with the crime. This is how the gun ends up over there. It's only after this that Julian realizes that a man has been murdered and that a black Suburban was taken. He remembers seeing the black Suburban. He knows that kind of all of this is going down, and he says that he gets scared. So he's kind of in a situation where he's not really going out in public a lot. He's trying to hide to figure out what's going on. And then he gets a phone call from a detective, and the detective says that he needs to speak with him. Now, while all this is going on, we now know that, according to Julian's story, while this is all going on, we now know that King has already gone to the police, and that the police have already talked to Chris Jordan as well. So basically what you have is, just to kind of break these two down, Julius is saying that because there's a lot, if you listen to Julius's story, whenever he retells the events of everything that took place over about 3 days, he is very detailed, very descriptive about the things that he does. He knows where he went, who he was with. He knows how he found out about the Suburban. He knows in what place he saw it at. He knows where it's left at. And he has an alibi that seems like it's pretty solid. But the problem is that in this case, we have not heard about his alibi until years and years after the trial. None of this comes up at the trial, and it coming out later on seems a little suspicious that now, like, oh, all of a sudden, he has this story with an alibi. And everybody that can give him an alibi is a family member. So it comes off to some people as a little bit sketchy, maybe. But if you listen to Chris in his interview with the Pardons and Parole Board, he says that basically he told his attorneys that he wanted to speak, that he wanted to testify in his own defense, and that his attorneys did not allow him to do that. And after his defense team rested their case, he was told not to make a scene in front of the judge or jury because these people were literally holding his life in their hands, and that he did not need to raise a stink about it. He just needed to go on, and they would, figure this out and see what happens. But unfortunately for him, it didn't work out very well because he was put on death row. So when you take the two stories and you look at them at face value, we see it seems a little bit strange to me that if this was Julius's alibi the entire time, how did it not get out? How did no one ever know about this before the jury trial? How was this kind of seemingly swept under the rug if he had this alibi? And for Julius, he blames it on his defense team at the time. I believe that we have seen in a lot of different cases that people can be represented by attorneys that do not know what they're doing. I know that in several instances, Julius spoke about how he would have an attorney and then they would quit or leave or something would happen and then he'd be given another attorney. One of the attorneys that was on Julius's defense team had never tried a capital murder case, and To my knowledge, I don't think he has tried one since. And the other two people that were assigned to Julius's defense team, he said over about a month's time, only spoke with him a few times. So we'll go through and look at some of the things that happened. I think that kind of point out that his defense kind of botched his case. And then we'll look at some other things that kind of tie in with this. What the Innocence Project kind of posted on their page, innocenceproject.org, is that there were 8 key things that are missing for this Julius Jones case that kind of show that he was kind of railroaded. And one of the things that will come up is that there were some witness affidavits and some other things that were kind of seemingly overlooked in this whole process. So we'll get to it. They've got 8 things that they say that need to be looked at. And the first one is that Julius was at home having dinner with his parents and his sister at the time of the murder, and that his legal team failed to present his alibi at the original trial. His trial attorney did not call Mr. Jones or any family members to the stand. And that is a big deal if you're going to try to corroborate Jones's testimony. That would be huge. That would be a huge oversight if that was the case. The second thing is that Jones did not match the description of the person who was said to have committed the crime, which, provided by a witness at the scene of the murder, the person who killed Mr. Howell, was described as having 1 to 2 inches of hair. And the way that this whole thing played out was that an eyewitness said that the person that murdered Paul Howell had on a red bandana, which is what the murder weapon was found in, but that the red bandana was tied around their head and they could see hair poking out from the bandana, and they said it was about a half an inch to an inch, and in this I read that it's 1 inch to 2 inches, so somewhere between a half an inch and 2 inches long hair. At the time, Julius had a shaved head. He had kind of a crew cut, and one of the things that helps corroborate all this is that there was a picture of Julius about 2 or 3 days before the murder took place, and he had short hair in that picture. So you couldn't say that he shaved his head after all this took place, because he had his crew cut before the incident took place. Now, one of the interesting things is that Chris Jones did have hair that was longer. He had cornrows at the time, but the sides were kind of grown out, and it was a little bit bushy on the side. And so if the witness statement was true, then the person who carjacked Paul Howell that had the longer hair would have looked more like Chris Jordan than Julius Jones. And the fact that this witness statement kind of never came up in trial surprises me a lot. Now, the third thing they point out is that Christopher Jordan matches the eyewitness hair description, but claims only to have been the getaway driver, quote unquote, and not the shooter. So I think 2 and 3 can kind of be put together, but I can understand why they're separating everything out. And then they stated that because of this, Chris Jordan ends up becoming the state's star witness against Julius Jones, and that is why ultimately they believe that this information was overlooked, because they had already gone off the fact that Chris Jordan had given them the statement that Julius Jones was the shooter, and now this witness affidavit that they have contradicts what Jordan is telling them, but they're going to go ahead and go with it. They're going to go ahead and let it ride. Number 4, there were 3 different people that were incarcerated with Chris at different points of time in his sentence, and they have said in sworn affidavits that Chris Jordan told each of them that he committed the murder and that he framed Julius Jones. One thing they point out is that none of the 3 men had ever met Julius, and that the 3 men do not even know one another. None of them have been offered any shorter sentences or incentives in exchange for disclosing that Chris Jones told them this. That is completely opposite of what happened for the witnesses against Julius Jones. Chris and King were both given reductions in sentence or nothing at all. One of the other things they point out is that Mr. Howell, who was a white man, was killed in a predominantly white neighborhood. Immediately, then District Attorney Bob Macy, which is the guy I mentioned earlier, characterized the crime as an act of violence committed by a black man, fueled by drugs. And this narrative was picked up and covered by the media, and this is when Bob Macy says that he is going to pursue the death penalty. It is stated that one of the officers that arrested Julius called him the N-word, and at one point took the handcuffs off of him and dared him to run, saying that, telling him basically, run inward, because if you do, I'm going to shoot you. Something to that effect. 11 out of the 12 jurors for Julius's trial were white, and one of the jurors referred to Julius by the N-word and suggested that he be taken out behind the courthouse and shot. And I looked into this accusation, and it's covered by multiple news outlets. And one of the things that I read that interests me about that particular statement is because statement about the officer calling him the N-word and telling him to run doesn't really affect, although improper, and this officer should be dismissed if that were the case. And I'm sure he probably doesn't work there anymore, but if this accusation was true, then this officer should have been dismissed from his job. But the third one is a little bit concerning to me, because it is said that the majority of the black jurors that were on there during the voir dire process were struck because at the time the prosecution, the DA's office, stated that they had criminal records. That's the reason that they were struck from the jury, not because of their race. However, one of the gentlemen that was later put on the trial as part of the jury also had felony records, so they didn't understand how those two correlated. And if you're familiar with the voir dire process, each side only has so many strikes. So it is safe to say that the prosecution used the majority of its strikes to remove people that they felt like would possibly err on the side of Julius Jones, which, to no surprise, is pretty common practice. And regardless of race or however that goes down, I'm saying it's common for the prosecution or the defense to try to get people on the jury that might lean in their favor one way or the other. That's why they ask a lot of questions to the jurors to kind of see where they line up. And then each side is given a certain amount of strikes to where they can remove jurors, and then more kind of file in and take their place. And then after they get to the process, they have the people that they're going to have for their jury plus their alternates. So the one thing that is concerning to me also about this is that I read that there was a juror that sent a letter to the judge, because that is common for them to do if they have questions or concerns. Sent a letter to the judge and told the judge that one of the jurors in there did refer to Julius as the N-word and said that that he should be taken out behind the courthouse or the jail and shot. And when the judge got this message, basically what happens and what they say is that he dismissed the whole thing and didn't do anything about it. Now, if in fact this happened, which from all accounts it looks like it did, there is a strong case of a prejudice by that jury member, and because of that prejudice, he should have been removed from the jury. Right there, I feel like if that story is able to be corroborated, then Julius Jones, it would seem that he deserves another crack at a fair trial, because this would indicate that he was not given a fair trial based off of that jury member and the things that he said. Now also, he's saying this in full view of the other jury members, so you have a strong argument to say that this juror could have contaminated other jurors and the way of their thinking based off the statements that he gave. The last thing that they point out is that 1/3 of of District Attorney Macy's death penalty convictions had been turned over due to the prosecution misconduct. Many of the convictions that were vacated were on black individuals, and to date, 10 people sentenced to death in murder cases in Oklahoma have been exonerated. There have been some stories that came up about Bob Macy that he withheld evidence in certain cases. There was another deal that he was able to turn somebody in like a state's crime lab to sort of fabricate evidence against people to help secure convictions. And so he was forced to retire. I don't know if he was disbarred, but I know he was forced to retire and leave the DA's office, which, if all of these things are true, if he was having someone at a forensics lab change evidence or fabricate evidence, then he should have, and that person should have gone to prison. And that is another thing, in my opinion, that really gives me a firmer opinion that Jones, based off the information from Macy's deception in other cases, that he should be given another trial, or his case should be given a time served, because he's already been in prison for over 20 years. One of the other things that they point out, and this is just a side note, is that the jury believed that Chris was given 30 years to life for his sentence, and for his cooperation, he was not given the death penalty. The jury was under the impression that he was getting 30 years to life. However, Chris only served 15 years, so only half of the 30 years that he was originally scheduled to serve, and definitely not a life sentence, because he was released after just 15 years. And this is a situation that I think, because of the way that that was handled, it puts a lot of pressure on Julius, because he's kind of the last man standing. He's the last one in prison. He's the last person that has accountability for Paul Howell's death. And I think that is why the family is so dead set on on Jones not only remaining in prison, but how set they were on that they wanted the execution to take place and go through, because they believe that Julius Jones is the one that murdered Paul Howell. Now, why do they believe this? I spoke about this earlier, but they believe this because that's what the police told them. They believe this because that's what the DA's office told them. They told them, we got the guy, we know who it is, we've got confessions, Julius Jones is the man, no doubt, no matter what happens, that's the guy. And they believe that. And I don't think that it is unnecessary or it is hard to believe that they believe all of these things, because they need someone to be accountable for the murder of their loved one. And with the exception of Paul's girlfriend at the time, I believe the whole family is still set on Julius as being the murderer. It is his girlfriend at the time who believes that they may have the wrong guy based off the witness description, because that never got brought up in any of the trials. And it's still not really talked about as much as I think it should be. Not only that, but then you have the DA's office misconduct, and then you have the potential contamination and disqualification of the juror that didn't take place. So I think if you build all those things up, you got a pretty strong case that at least he should have been given a different trial, or it should have been looked at possibly before now. But like I said, Julius is the last person that can be held accountable for Howell's murder, because King didn't get any time at all. He was let go for his cooperation. Chris Jordan served 15 years. He's out. They can't go back and retry Chris Jordan. What's done is done. The only way that they can have any sort of closure on this case is if Julius remains in jail, because if Julius gets out, this proves that there was a mistake somewhere, and they are probably going to feel like they got screwed in this whole deal, which it looks like quite possibly they did. That they can't go back and put the real murderer in jail if it is found that Julius is not the real murderer. If Chris Jordan was the one that pulled the trigger, then you let him out after 15 years and there's nothing you can do about that. You can't go back and change that. Now I want to get into what we have as maybe some things that go against what Julius Jones has said. So previous to this murder, Julius had, let me backtrack. After the murder had taken place, Julius pled guilty to a carjacking that occurred before the murder. So the trial for the carjacking took place after the trial for the murder. But Jones pled guilty to a carjacking that took place 6 days before the Howell murder. And in the carjacking, the suspect used a used a bandana and used a gun in order to carjack the Mercedes. And I think that may be something you can look at to point to the fact that this is something that Julius had done before. Or I think you could look at it in a different way. And I think that you can look at it in the way of Chris and Julian and King all knew each other, and they might have had a deal going on where they were carjacking people and taking their vehicles to a chop shop to get extra money. And so they knew the patterns, they knew the places, they knew everything about each other, so all of these stories can kind of be intertwined with each other. Julius Jones had 25 caliber bullets in his personal vehicle, and at the time of the murder, Julius Jones's vehicle was said to be broken down with transmission trouble. So the entire time this incident was taking place, Julius Jones's car was not even really in the picture. But he had 25 caliber bullets in his personal vehicle. 25 caliber gun was used to kill Paul Howell. That was another connection that they made. And I know I'm kind of giving you these bits and pieces as we're going along, but I'm just trying to tie this all together. Next, you had a witness that stated that they were at Jones's parents' house on the night of the murder, and she said that she was at the Joneses' house and that Julius was not present while she was there. It's also said that Julius's attorneys later stated that he had admitted to them that he wasn't at the house at the time of the murder, and that's why they didn't use that as his alibi. Julius would later say that never happened, that conversation never took place, and if it did, if his attorneys think that it did, it was by mistake, because he was at his parents' house, and that's this person who was at his parents' house says that they were there on the night that the murder happened and he wasn't there. His parents are saying that she is thinking of the day before the murders, that she was at their house the day before the murders. Julius was at his parents' house the day of the murders. And I know this is kind of getting confusing, and I feel like I'm running in circles here as well, but there's a lot going on with all of this. So in this scenario, you have a witness that says that they're at the house the night of the murder. Julius wasn't there. Julius's attorneys say that the reason they didn't bring up that as an alibi is because Julius himself said that he wasn't at his parents' house. Julius says that never happened and that he was at his parents' house, and Julius's parents are saying that Julius was there the night of the murder and that this person saying that they were at their house was actually the day before. So we got a lot of different stories going on there now, and that's why I feel like this thing is so crazy and this so confusing, because all of this is happening, it's taking place 20 years after the murder. So how can you really go about and label and kind of tie all this down as significant enough evidence to help overturn Julius' conviction? And in that scenario, I'm not really sure, because I'm not privy to all the evidence that they may have one way or the other. And if you're basing it off of witness statements that are 20 years old now, I don't know a judge or a appeals court that might let that evidence go. That's why I truly believe that it's the discrimination, the racial discrimination against him from the juror, and the the attorney, the district attorney, Bob Macy, that's got that laundry list of felonies that he committed while he was a district attorney, I think that's where the bread and butter of the new trial or the acquittal is. It's in that right there. I think it would be hard to be able to get all this evidence and tie it in 20 years later, because it is just family that is going to testify that he has this alibi. So I'm going to kind of give you 3 scenarios how I think this whole thing could have gone down. Because like I said, there's a lot of information that goes into this. There's a lot of things that are pointed to Julius as being the gunman and Chris being the wheelman, vice versa. Not at all. I think there is both sides are trying very hard to point the finger in the other direction. And by that, I mean that if you look up anything on Julius Jones from his side, it is said that he was a smart kid, which he was. He was 11th in his class out of over 150 students, I believe. He had a academic scholarship to OU, and he is said to have been on the basketball team there. Now, if you look at it from the other side, people will say that he did get a full-ride scholarship to OU, but that he was on academic probation and that he couldn't have been playing basketball with the university because his grades weren't good enough. And then you see his family portraying him as this nice guy. You see the defenders of Paul Howell portraying him as this guy who was dishonest and a thief and a scammer and all these different things, because Jones, I believe, had a criminal history. But that criminal history doesn't necessarily mean that he's a murderer. Was he involved in some carjackings? According to the information, he at least did one, because he pled guilty to it. When Jones was asked about this in his parole and pardons hearing, he said that the reason that he pled guilty to that charge is because he was given a new attorney less than 30 days before the trial started, and that the judge said that it wasn't her fault that he had to change attorneys and the case was going to proceed, and that he was afraid that something was going to happen. I'm not really sure of the full details on that case because it wasn't disclosed in the detail that this one was. I just know that he had pled guilty to another carjacking before this. So one of the other things that he had gotten in trouble for is because Chris apparently pretty good at basketball himself, as well as Julius Jones, and that's how they kind of met each other in school. And Jones said that he wasn't going to be able to get into college because he couldn't take the SATs and pass them. And so Julius said that he would take if I said Jones, I meant Chris Jordan. I apologize. Chris Jordan could not get into school because he couldn't pass his SATs. Julius Jones said that he would take the test for him, and that way he would be able to get into college and play basketball and get an education. So Julius Jones had been in trouble for basically saying that he was someone else to take a test, and that's kind of how you get this kind of forgery deal, I believe, that he had been charged with before this, because he claimed to be someone else and took a state test, and you know how yada yada yada, that's how that goes. But you have different people pointing in different directions, and it just, in my mind, it's hard for me to keep it all separated because everybody's coming out so strongly one way or the other. And so let me give you my take on the 3 possible scenarios as to what happened in this case. Possibility number 1 is that it all happened the way it played out in court. Julius Jones meets up with Chris Jordan. They decide that they are going to go steal some cars because it is said at the time that Julius Jones, he himself said that he enjoyed the finer things in life and he couldn't afford some of these things, so he would steal and do other things in order to get the finer things that he couldn't afford. And even though looked down upon, he said that was just a problem that he had in his youth, and that he wished he could go back and change it, but he can't. But if we're going off of possibility number one, Jones and Jordan show up. They follow Paul Howell. Julius walks up, tries to carjack Paul. There's some resistance. Something happens. Paul gets shot. Jones steals the Suburban. Chris is the wheelman, and everything plays out just like they said in court. Possibility number two is that the roles are reversed. You have Chris Jones, who is the shooter, and you have Chris Jordan. See, that's what I'm saying. It gets confusing. You have Chris Jordan, who is the shooter. You have Julius Jones, who is the wheelman. And in this scenario, I believe that's how you get the witness testimony that the person who fired the shot that killed Paul had the longer hair, which doesn't match Jones. So everything kind of plays out the same way. They try to get the Suburban into a chop shop. It doesn't happen. But in the meantime, Chris Jordan goes to Liddell King and says, hey, I think we're going to get, there's a lot of heat on this. I think we got to kind of get our ducks in a row here before this all goes and the police come up and start asking us questions. We got to get our story straight. Let's just say that Julius Jones is the one who was the gunman, and we're just kind of in all this and try to cut deals. Now, the third possibility is that Chris Jordan and Liddell King did the entire thing, and Julius was the fall guy. Now, if we go off this assumption, it is based on the fact that I believe that Chris Jordan, Julius Jones, and Liddell King were all engaging in organized criminal activity together. They would steal cars, they would take them to chop shops, and then they would get the money off of them. And that was this kind of business that they were working. This might be why all these extra things that were going on outside of school might be why Julius Jones was on academic probation. And so you have these three individuals that are already engaging in organized crime together, and that whenever push comes to shove, they're playing chess, not checkers, and they decide that after the murder, they're going to have to pin this on Julius. Otherwise, they're going to go to prison for the rest of their life, or they're going to go on death row. And so Chris goes over to Julius's house and plants the gun. That would mean that everything that Julius said up until this point about his alibi is true. And that after Chris planted the gun, he called King and said that it was in place. King goes and talks to the police. The police then, like I said earlier, go to the person who would have been second involved. King goes to the police and says, look, these guys brought this vehicle to me. They wanted me to take it to a chop shop. I knew that it had been involved in a murder, and I couldn't do it. So they dumped the vehicle. Here I am talking to you. And they're like, okay, well, who shot Paul Howell? Julius Jones shot Paul Howell. Okay. And Chris was with him. Okay, so now let's go talk to Chris Jordan. They go talk to Chris Jordan. They say, hey, Liddell King came and told us that this happened. Is that true? Yes, it is true. I was the wheelman. Julius is the one that shot the guy. You can find the gun at Julius's house up in the attic. They go over there, find the gun, boom, he's framed. And in this scenario, the part that kind of stuck out to me was that Julius has this gun in his house that he hides, and if he was aware of all of these things going on, I think he would have made a better effort at getting rid of the murder weapon if that was in fact his murder weapon. I don't think it helps that they found 25 auto bullets in his vehicle after all this is said and done, but that is also something that Julius Jones says he does not know how these bullets got in his car, because he was arrested they searched his car after all this was done. They found the bullets. So if you're looking at it from that way, is there a possibility that the bullets got planted in his car too? Well, if we're going off this theory, I don't know why we couldn't say that that's a possibility also. But I think that those are the three possible scenarios that I came up with, because based off the information we have, I think those are the best place. You have either it happened the way it did, the roles were reversed, and Julius was a wheelman and not the murderer, and they made some sort of pact. And I imagine this, when I was thinking through this, I imagined this scenario going down. Say Chris Jordan walks up, carjacks Paul Howell. Paul Howell gets killed. After this is all said and done, Chris goes back and tells Julius, we got to keep our story straight. We can't talk to the cops. No matter what happens, never admit to any of this. Even if the cops come in and tell you that I've told on you, or they tell me that you've told on me, we keep our story straight. So Julius says he doesn't know what's going on. Chris frames him for the murder. Or Julius wasn't involved at all. So it, to me, seems like it is either it happened the way that it played out in court, or Chris and Laudell King possibly framed Julius Jones, and he was the one that was stuck with the murder. Like I said before, I think this is a very hard case to follow as far as the evidence goes, because I'm uncertain about all of the DNA evidence that might tie Jones to this. But I know that there was enough question to get him off death row. And as pointed out by one of the listeners and one of our friends of the show, it's always better to err on the side of life, because you can't go back and change a death penalty case where if in 5 years, and I know I paraphrased that, you can't go back in 5 years if we find out Julius Jones was innocent and take back a death penalty because he's dead. If something comes up in this and is found that he is 100% proof positive that Julius Jones is the trigger man, he is in prison for life without the possibility of parole. He was spared the death penalty. That's something at least we can probably all get on the same page of and go, there's enough conflicts here that I believe that Julius at least deserves not to be on death row. And if the case about the jurors and the things that took place with that are true, I believe you had a tainted jury. You had a district attorney's, an ADA that had a lot of misconduct associated with his name. And I think you got a shot there. But like I said, this is one of those, this is a case that it was happening right now. It was just last week that all of this kind of took place, and Julius was taken off death row just 4 hours before he was supposed to be executed. And I can't imagine sitting in that cell waiting to see if you hear back from the governor whether or not you're going to be executed or not. Because one of the crazy things that could have happened in this case also is while they were waiting for the governor to sign off on this to say that his execution was overturned and he was given life without parole, is that the governor could have done nothing. And by doing nothing, he could have agreed that Julius's death sentence should have been carried out. And if he would have not signed off and not taken any action, then the execution would have gone on as scheduled. So by doing nothing, he could have said everything. But that wasn't the case. He was spared the death penalty, and here we are. And, if you reach out, if you have any questions or comments about this, I know there's a lot of information that was packed into this, and I kind of had an outline of the way that I wanted to do it, but as I was rolling through the story, there's a lot of information that is pointing one way or the other, and to me, it's very easy for it to get kind of mixed into kind of the same basket, and trying to separate all that out. It's really difficult, and that's another reason why I think we need to look into this. And Chris Jordan's basically disappeared after he got out of prison. He kind of fell off the grid, which is probably good for him. And in this situation, one of the things that kind of came up after all this is that Chris Jordan did make a statement through his attorney at one point in all this, and his attorney stated that Chris Jordan maintains his position that his role in the death of Paul Howell was as an accomplice to Julius Jones. The statement from the lawyer, Billy Bach, said, Mr. Jordan testified truthfully in the jury trial of Mr. Jones and denies confessing to anyone. That's related to him confessing to 3 different people that he was the one that committed the murder. So he's saying that his information was truthful and that he didn't have anything to do with it. And it's just, man, it's a wild story. And I wanted to bring this one to y'all because I thought it at least needed to be looked at. I hope I did a good enough job explaining it. Sometimes I get a lot of stuff bouncing around up in the old noggin, and it's hard to get it out of there, out of my mouth into the microphone, and kind of make it all make sense. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please reach out and let me know. If Mike's able to sit down and do a debrief with me on this, that'd be awesome, because I'm sure we could toss around several different ideas. I tried to encompass both on this, giving kind of the details of the case and also my opinion. So hopefully I did okay on that. Let me know if you have any questions, concerns. But until next time, we'll see you guys later. Goodbye. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening to this episode of The Murder Project. Our numbers are going up, our downloads are going up, and we have you to thank for that. If you need to get a hold of us on any of the social media platforms, you can find us on Facebook. We're at The Murder Project. If you need to search for us, you can type in facebook.com/podcasttmp. If you're looking for us on Instagram, we're at The Murder Project. And if you're looking for us on Twitter, we are at The Murder Pod. Also, as I mentioned in the episode, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, we have an email if you want to reach out to us. That is contact@themurderproject.com. And I'll get back to you with anything that you have, any questions, anything like that. Please let me know. That's going to do it for this episode of The Murder Project. Thank you so much for listening and tuning in. I look forward to speaking to you guys again soon. But before I go, please remember, head up, eyes up, and stay alive.